This morning, as you reached for your phone, perhaps, to check the weather, perhaps just to scroll through headlines, something happened that may change not just Africa, but the entire digital world. And it happened without a single word from Silicon Valley, without a glossy keynote from Google or Microsoft. Quietly, almost in silence, Africa flipped the switch on an internet of its own. For decades, we were told that the internet was universal, borderless fare. But that was an illusion. The web you and I know is not a free highway. It's a toll road owned and patrolled by a handful of corporations based in California and Seattle. Google decides what knowledge rises to the top. Amazon and Microsoft set the price of access and storage. For more than 20 years, Africa's 1.4 billion people were forced to pay these tolls to route their data across oceans, to live under rules they did not write. That era ended today. The African Union has unveiled what it calls the Continental Internet Exchange, a digital declaration of independence, a revolution built not for Wall Street investors, but for African citizens. For the first time in modern history, an entire continent has stopped renting someone else's digital roads and started building its own. And here lies the question that shakes the world: what happens when one of every 6 human beings on this planet no longer depends on America's digital empire? What happens to Google, to Washington, to the very idea of a unified internet? Stay with me until the end, because this story is not only about Africa's future, it is about yours. If you believe that truth matters more than monopolies, hit subscribe. And if you want to be among the very first to witness the dawn of a post-Google era, share this video now. For most of us, the internet feels invisible. Type click, and within seconds, an answer appears. But behind that instant response lies a vast hidden architecture of cable servers and exchange points. For Africa, that architecture has always been foreign and punishing. Every search, every message, every transaction had to leave the continent before circling back, like mailing a letter to your neighbor, but first sending it across the Atlantic. This system carried 3 heavy burdens. First, it was expensive. Africa has long paid some of the highest internet costs in the world, not because of weak demand, but because it was essentially renting space on someone else's infrastructure. Second, it was slow and unreliable. A student in Nairobi downloading a textbook might wait 5 or 10 times longer than a student in Paris, simply because of the detour. And third, it concentrated power in the hands of Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, who not only provided the service, but also held the keys to Africa's digital gates. Every click passed under their surveillance. Every payment carried a hidden toll. That fragile dependency is what ended when the African Union unveiled the Continental Internet Exchange. More than just a new service provider, this is an entirely separate backbone, 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable threading across mountains and deserts, 47 major data centers rising in capitals and provincial towns, and dozens of exchange points stitched into every major city from Dar es Salaam to Johannesburg to Ouagadougou. Together, they form Africa's nervous system, a network designed to keep traffic within the continent, to process data locally, and to place African voices first. To understand why this matters, picture a young entrepreneur in Burkina Faso. She is building an app to connect local farmers with markets. In the old system, even her neighbor 5 miles away might have to access her app through a server in Europe, paying inflated fees and waiting for delayed signals. Now, with the Continental Exchange, her data never leaves African soil. Farmers in Ouagadougou or Bobo-Dioulasso can log in instantly without hidden costs siphoned to shareholders in Silicon Valley. What was once an uphill battle is now a level playing field. Education too transforms overnight. A student in Nairobi who once cursed slow downloads can now stream lectures without interruption. A teenager in Lagos can access coding tutorials in seconds rather than hours. And crucially, the content itself changes. Under the old regime, search results often buried African history, languages, and knowledge under layers of European summaries. An African youth might know more about Napoleon than about the Mali Empire simply because of algorithmic bias. The new system rewrites that script. Its distributed knowledge mapping highlights African universities, local institutions, and oral histories digitized in native languages. When someone searches for Burkina Faso independence, they no longer wade through filtered Western accounts, they hear African voices first. The symbolism is profound. For decades, connectivity was equated with dependency, as if joining the global digital economy required submission to Western frameworks. Now the infrastructure itself tells a different story. Africa is not a user of someone else's system. It is the architect of its own. And the adoption is staggering. Within days of the launch, hundreds of millions connected. The reason is simple: it works better. It is faster, cheaper, and more attuned to cultural realities. Where once people rented space on foreign roads, now they travel freely on their own. This is the heart of the event, the moment a continent stopped asking permission. It built its own digital arteries, kept its wealth circulating within its borders, and declared in code and fiber that sovereignty in the 21st century means more than gold reserves or farmland. It means cable servers and the power to tell your own story. The turning point came faster than anyone imagined. Within just 3 days of the launch, over 200 million Africans had migrated to the new system. No digital platform in history, not Facebook, not TikTok, not WhatsApp, had ever achieved adoption on that scale that quickly. What the outside world thought would be a symbolic gesture turned into a continental exodus. The message was loud and unmistakable. Africans had never been loyal to Silicon Valley's networks. They were trapped by lack of alternatives. The moment they were given a choice, they walked out en masse. This was the climax of the story. In cities across the continent, the change was immediate and tangible. In Nairobi, students who once battled buffering bars found themselves streaming live lectures without interruption. In Lagos, shopkeepers noticed transaction fees falling as payments no longer had to circle through Europe. In Ouagadougou, journalists described the shock of searching in local languages and receiving results from African archives instead of European summaries. The digital chains had been broken, and people could feel it in their daily lives. In Mountain View, California, the reaction was panic. Inside Google's glass towers, executives gathered in emergency meetings as maps of Africa lit up with adoption rates climbing by the second. This was not a competitor they could buy, copy, or outspend. For decades, Google's strength lay in its ability to absorb rivals, swallowing YouTube, imitating Snapchat, or out-advertising Bing. But the African Digital Protocol was different. It had been designed to be incompatible. Google's search crawlers and systems and cloud platforms simply could not function on the new network without a complete rebuild. For the first time in its history, Google faced an opponent it could not assimilate. Microsoft and Amazon quickly realized the stakes were just as high. Their empires depend on cloud computing contracts with governments, corporations, and universities. For years, African states had funneled billions into Azure and AWS servers in distant lands. Now, those contracts were evaporating overnight, replaced by African-built data centers. A $50 billion revenue stream that had quietly flowed from Africa to Western shareholders each year was drying up, redirected into local economies. Washington, too, felt the tremors. For decades, the U.S. had treated the internet as an extension of its soft power, a tool as potent as Hollywood or the dollar. By controlling infrastructure, it could pressure governments, throttle opposition movements, or monitor flows of information. The Continental Internet Exchange stripped those levers away. For policymakers in Washington, the question was immediate and urgent. Should the U.S. intervene? Could sanctions be justified under the guise of digital security? Or would such pressure only push Africa closer to Russia and China, who were already watching with keen interest across the Atlantic? Paris and London were equally unsettled. Both capitals carry long histories of shaping African narratives through education systems, media channels, and digital pipelines. Now, those narratives were being rewritten by Africans themselves. To French and British policymakers, the risk was not just economic but cultural, the loss of influence over how Africa sees itself and how it presents its story to the world. Inside Africa, however, the mood was entirely different. Leaders hailed the launch as sovereignty made real, not in slogans or speeches, but in fiber cables and data hubs. Youth movements celebrated it as proof that Africa could innovate rather than imitate. And voices like Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré tied it directly to the broader struggle for independence. If we can reclaim our minds, our farmland, and now our internet, then the days of dependency are truly ending. Beyond Africa, the ripple effects spread quickly. In South America, leaders announced they were studying the African model for their own regional networks. In Asia, where governments had long debated alternatives to Silicon Valley's grip, the African example was suddenly proof that large-scale independence was not only possible, but effective. What began as an African solution was becoming a global movement. The climax was not just the switch of 200 million users, it was the global chain reaction it triggered. Africa had shown that the internet need not belong to a handful of corporations or a single superpower. With one bold act, the continent shattered assumptions that had guided the digital age for decades. For the West, it was a moment of reckoning. For Africa, it was a moment of triumph. When the switch was flipped, the benefits reached far beyond technology. For ordinary citizens, the change was felt in something far deeper: dignity. For years, Africans had been paying some of the highest internet prices in the world for some of the slowest and least reliable service. A family in Burkina Faso might have spent a painful share of their monthly income just to keep their children connected for schoolwork. Now, with infrastructure controlled locally, those hidden costs began to vanish. What was once a privilege became a right. In classrooms, the difference was transformative. Students in remote villages could join virtual lessons without worrying about sudden disconnections. Teachers could access African scholarship databases instead of outdated Western summaries. In rural clinics, doctors shared patient data securely without routing it through servers thousands of miles away. These were not abstract improvements. They were lifelines changing the daily experience of millions. The economic effects were equally profound. For decades, roughly $50 billion per year flowed out of Africa to pay for Western cloud services, data routing, and licensing fees. That money is now staying home. Instead of feeding shareholders in Seattle or California, it circulates within African economies, funding the construction of data centers, paying African engineers, and seeding African startups. The multiplier effect is dramatic. Every dollar reinvested creates jobs in construction software, education, and maintenance. From Dakar to Lusaka, a new digital economy is being born, not imported. But perhaps the most striking consequences are political. For years, Africa's reliance on Western internet infrastructure gave outside powers immense leverage. Governments could be threatened with digital sanctions. Opposition movements could be throttled on platforms headquartered overseas. Critical data could be monitored or manipulated without consent. The Continental Internet Exchange shifts that balance. By keeping traffic within African borders, the continent gains a shield of digital sovereignty. Foreign powers can no longer pull the plug, slow the flow, or dictate terms with the same ease. This newfound control resonates powerfully with Africa's rising generation. Over 60% of the continent's population is under 25. They are digital natives, young men and women who grew up with smartphones, but without systems designed for them. For years, they navigated platforms that prioritized foreign languages, foreign stories, and foreign values. Now, the African Digital Protocol speaks directly to their identities. It validates who they are. When they search for their history, they see themselves not as footnotes in someone else's textbook, but as authors of their own narrative. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. To a generation often told that true innovation comes only from the West, the Continental Exchange is living proof that Africa can lead, not follow. And to political leaders, it is tangible evidence that sovereignty is not rhetoric. It is infrastructure you can see, touch, and use. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who has long warned against dependency in mining, agriculture, and foreign aid, now points to data cables and server farms as proof that independence can be engineered. Of course, sovereignty brings responsibility. With control over their own digital systems, African governments also face the challenge of ensuring transparency, protecting freedom of speech, and resisting the temptation to abuse the very independence they fought to win. Civil society groups are already calling for safeguards to prevent states from using the new network as a tool of surveillance or censorship. Independence, they remind, must serve the people, not just the politicians. Yet the symbolism remains undeniable. For the first time in the digital age, Africa is not simply connected, it is in control. Civil life is richer, political life is freer, and the vision of true independence is visible in the glowing screens of ordinary citizens. From Washington's perspective, the launch of Africa's Continental Internet Exchange was nothing short of a geopolitical earthquake. For 2 decades, U.S. leaders assumed that Silicon Valley's giants Google, Amazon, Microsoft would remain permanent fixtures of global life. The Internet itself was treated as an extension of American influence, a soft power tool as potent as Hollywood or the dollar. Now that assumption is collapsing. For Google, the fear is existential, losing access to a market of 4 billion people is not just about revenue, it weakens their dominance in data collection, which powers everything from search algorithms to artificial intelligence. Because the African protocol was built to be incompatible, Google cannot simply buy its way back in. To participate, it would need to rebuild its entire infrastructure, a project costing hundreds of billions and taking decades. For the first time, the so-called indispensable gateway to the Internet has met a door it cannot unlock. Washington policymakers face an equally uncomfortable dilemma. For years, the U.S. wielded digital infrastructure as leverage in diplomacy. Cloud access payment systems and data routing were tools of pressure often deployed against governments seen as unfriendly. Africa's new network blocks those tools. If a country can keep its data on its own soil and run its systems independently, then the U.S. can no longer tighten the screws at will. This loss of leverage comes at a delicate moment as American influence is already challenged by China's Belt and Road initiatives and Russia's growing partnerships. In Europe, the sense of unease is just as strong. France and the UK, with long colonial legacies in Africa, have long relied on cultural and technological channels to maintain relevance. But if African narratives are now written by African voices, Europe risks being pushed to the margins. Policymakers in Paris and London fear not only economic loss, but also the erosion of cultural influence that has shaped Africa's global image for generations. Outside the West, however, the reaction has been almost celebratory. In South America, leaders quickly announced plans to study the African model, hoping to free themselves from costly dependence on foreign servers. In Asia, where regional internet ecosystems already exist, the African example is now proof that large-scale independence is not only possible but practical. What began as an African solution is spreading into a global conversation. Should the internet remain unified under Western corporations, or should every region build its own sovereign networks? For older Americans watching this unfold, the implications are profound. The internet they once knew a symbol of openness and freedom is splintering into regional ecosystems. Some view this as a threat to the global commons, but others recognize it as a natural correction. After all, nations already control their borders, their currencies, and their armies. Why should their digital lifelines be any different? And so the question lands back in Washington: will the U.S. resist this shift, risking backlash and pushing Africa closer to rival powers? Or will it adapt, acknowledging that America's monopoly on digital innovation is not eternal? The answer will shape not just Africa's future, but the future of the internet itself. The launch of Africa's Continental Internet Exchange is more than a headline, it is a warning to the rest of the world. For decades, Western corporations assumed they would forever dictate how information flows, how innovation spreads, and who pays the tolls. That assumption has been shattered. Africa has shown that with vision, cooperation, and determination, even the most entrenched monopolies can be challenged. But let us be clear, this story is not finished. History teaches us that when nations take bold steps toward independence, they often face resistance, sometimes open, sometimes hidden. Washington may attempt to reassert control through diplomatic pressure. Silicon Valley may unleash lobbying campaigns or covert partnerships designed to undermine the African digital protocol. And just as importantly, African governments themselves must resist the temptation to twist this new power into a tool of censorship or surveillance. Sovereignty without accountability can quickly become another form of oppression. The debate is now before us. What does digital freedom truly mean? Is it enough to build infrastructure, or must it also come with protections for speech privacy and human rights? And beyond Africa, how will the rest of the world respond? South America is already exploring its own continental model. Asia is watching closely. The dream of one unified global internet may be giving way to a patchwork of sovereign networks. Some call this fragmentation, others call it justice. For citizens of the United States, especially those who lived through the Cold War, the echoes are unmistakable. Once again, the balance of power is shifting not with tanks or missiles, but with fiber optic cables and lines of code. This time, Africa is not asking permission. It is writing the rules of its own digital future. And here lies the most personal question. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's vision of sovereignty from gold mines to farmland to now the internet is the model Africa truly needs? Or do you fear that without global checks, this independence could be twisted at home? If you feel you are among the first to witness this turning point in history, please share this video. And if you believe that truth matters more than monopolies, subscribe to our channel. The age of digital colonialism is ending. The only question left is whether it will fall quietly or collapse with a fight.